November 7th, 1908, 9 p.m., San Vicente, Bolivia. The silence was heavier than the gunfire. For hours, the high-altitude air of the Andes had been shredded by the crack of Mauser rifles. The air was thin. It was biting. It smelled of sulfur. The Bolivian night was absolute. It was a void of blackness that swallowed the small adobe boarding house. Inside that mud brick box, the 19th century was bleeding out. Outside, a perimeter of soldiers and local police shivered in the freezing rain. Their fingers were numb on their triggers. They were waiting for a movement that would not come. Then, the screaming stopped. It hadn't been a battle cry, it had been a sound of agony. 3 distinct screams. Desperate and animalistic, they pierced the lull in the firefight. They were followed by a single shot. Then a pause. Then another. And now, nothing. Just the wind howling off the Altiplano. It rattled the corrugated tin roofs of the mining camp. Captain Concha was the commander of the Abaroa regiment. He waited until the dawn began to bleed gray into the sky. Then he gave the order to breach. The soldiers moved in low. They kicked open the wooden door. The smell hit them first. It was the metallic copper tang of fresh blood. It was mixed with the acrid stench of spent cordite. The tableau inside was not a scene of heroic last stands. It was a scene of grim, logistical despair. The man they called the Sundance Kid lay curled against the wall. Here, he was just another bandit in a dusty coat. He was riddled with bullet wounds. His body was a map of the violence that had followed him. It followed him from the jagged peaks of Wyoming to this god-forsaken bowl of dust in South America. But it was the wound in his forehead that mattered. A clean, point-blank entry. Next to him lay the older man, the leader, the one with the face that had charmed barmaids from Telluride to Buenos Aires. He was slumped over. A Colt revolver was near his hand. He, too, bore a single, catastrophic wound to the temple. The official report was written in the cramped, bureaucratic hand of the Bolivian authorities. It would call it a mercy killing. The older man saw his partner in agony. He knew the noose was tightening outside. He had done the only thing left to do. He had euthanized his friend. And then he had turned the lights out on himself. It was a clean ending. It was dramatic. It was definitive. It was also, quite possibly, a lie. The bodies were hauled out into the courtyard. They were stiffening in the morning chill. They needed a name. The Bolivian army didn't know them. They only knew they were bandidos Yankees who had robbed the Aramayo payroll courier. The identification fell to a man named Percy Seibert. Seibert was an executive at the Concordia tin mines. He was a man of standing. He was a pillar of the expatriate community. He walked into the courtyard. He looked at the battered, blood-caked faces of the dead men. He nodded. "That is Butch Cassidy," he said. "And that is the Sundance Kid." His word was law. The file was closed. The bodies were dumped into a single grave in the local cemetery. It was marked only by a wooden cross that would soon rot away in the Andean wind. The world moved on. The newspapers ran the headlines. The kings of the outlaw trail are dead. But why did Seibert's eyes linger too long on the older man? Why did he volunteer the identification so quickly? History is often written by the victors. But in true crime, it is often edited by the accomplices. Seibert had dined with these men. He had liked them. He knew that the only way for a man like Butch Cassidy to truly escape the Pinkerton Detective Agency was to die. The Pinkertons hunted men with the relentless efficiency of a machine. If Butch Cassidy died in that adobe hut, he was a tragedy. If he walked away while another man rotted in his grave, he was a masterpiece. To understand the ghost, we must first understand the man. We have to rewind the tape. Back before the blood and the Bolivia mud, to a wooden cradle in the high desert of Utah, where a Mormon mother prayed over a boy who was born to be good, but destined to be bad. Beaver, Utah, 1866 to 1899. To understand the psychology of Robert LeRoy Parker, you have to scrape away the Hollywood gloss. Forget Paul Newman riding a bicycle to raindrops keep falling on my head. The reality was dustier, it was colder, it was far more desperate. Robert was born in 1866. He was the first of 13 children in a devout Mormon family. This geography is destiny. He wasn't raised in the lawless chaos of a gold rush camp. He was raised in the strict pious structure of the LDS Church. He was a boy of prayers and chores. He grew up in Circle Valley. It was a place of stunning, stark beauty. Red Rock canyons slashed through the earth like open wounds. He was, by all accounts, the good son. He was the one who broke the horses. He was the one who fixed the fences. He had a smile that could disarm a loaded shotgun, a soft, easy grin that sat comfortably beneath a mop of flaxen hair. He didn't have the dead eyes of a killer like Kid Curry. He didn't have the cold detachment of Harry Longabaugh. Robert Parker felt things. But the Utah of the 1880s was undergoing a violent economic shift. The era of the small homesteader was being crushed under the hooves of massive corporate cattle empires. Young Robert watched as the cattle barons squeezed the life out of families like his. They were backed by Eastern money and corrupt politicians. They fenced off the open range. They stole water rights. They bought the law. This is the golden thread of his psychology. Robert didn't start stealing because he was greedy. He started stealing because he was angry. He saw himself as a disenfranchised cowboy, an economic insurgent fighting a guerrilla war against a monopoly. When he first saddled up with his mentor, Mike Cassidy, he wasn't entering a life of crime. Mike Cassidy was a rough-edged ranch hand who taught him how to alter a brand and handle a six-gun. In Robert's mind, he was entering a life of justice. He took the name Cassidy as a tribute. He took Butch from a brief, honest stint, swinging a cleaver in a butcher shop in Rock Springs, Wyoming. Butch Cassidy didn't want your money. He wanted the bank's money. And there was a distinct difference. There is a reason he became the leader of the Wild Bunch. This was a loose confederation of outlaws that included the likes of Elzie Lay and Ben Kilpatrick. It wasn't because he was the fastest draw. It was because he was the smartest planner. Other gangs rode into town screaming and shooting. They left a trail of dead tellers and terrified widows. Cassidy treated a heist like a business transaction. Take the robbery of the Pleasant Valley Coal Company in Castlegate, Utah, in 1897. This wasn't a raid. It was a magic trick. The payroll train was due to arrive with thousands of dollars in gold. A standard outlaw gang would have blown the tracks or ambushed the guards. Cassidy just stood there. He leaned against a post in broad daylight. He was ostensibly watching the train arrive. He looked like any other dusty cowboy waiting for a job. The clerk unloaded the bags of gold. Cassidy didn't scream. He simply walked up. Calmness radiated off him like heat. He placed the barrel of his Colt against the clerk's ribs. "Sir," he reportedly said. His voice was level and polite. "I believe those belong to me." He took the gold. He cut the telegraph wires. He tipped his hat to the bystanders. And then he vanished into the landscape he knew better than God himself. No shots fired. No widows made. This was the Robin Hood avatar he cultivated. He would pay a widow's mortgage with one hand. He would rob the bank that held the note with the other. He relied on the silence of the locals. He bought their loyalty with gold coins and courtesy. He was the gentleman bandit. But the 19th century was dying. The 20th century was bringing a new kind of enemy. If Castle Gate was his masterpiece, the Tipton, Wyoming train robbery in August 1900 was the beginning of the end. It wasn't the robbery itself that doomed them. It was a photograph. The core members of the Wild Bunch strolled into a photography studio in Fort Worth, Texas. Butch, Sundance, Ben Kilpatrick, Will Carver, and Harvey Logan. They were flush with cash. They bought bowler hats and tailored suits. They sat for a portrait, the Fort Worth Five. It is a haunting image. Butch sits on the far right. His legs are crossed. That easy smile plays on his lips. He looks like a man without a care in the world. He didn't know that he was posing for his own wanted poster. That photograph found its way to the desk of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. The Pinkertons were not local sheriffs who could be bribed or outrun. They were a corporate paramilitary force. They were hired by the railroad tycoons to exterminate the bandit plague. They used modern forensics. They used a national network of informants, and they were relentless. They took the photo. They duplicated it. They plastered it across the West. Suddenly, the ghosts had faces. The anonymity of the high desert was gone. The net began to tighten. Butch felt the shift in the air. The outlaw trail was being fenced off. That glorious dusting path from Montana to Mexico was closing. The telegraph wires were humming with his name. He faced a binary choice: stay and die in a hail of gunfire like so many others, or vanish. He chose the abyss. In 1901, accompanied by Sundance and the mysterious, elegant Etta Place, Butch Cassidy boarded a steamship in New York City. Destination, Buenos Aires. He wasn't just running from the law. He was running from his own legend. He wanted to be a rancher. He wanted to be respectable. He wanted to be Robert Parker again. But as the steamer churned south, leaving the Statue of Liberty in its wake, Butch carried a secret. You can change your name. You can change your continent. But you cannot change your nature. The good bad man was about to find out that the devil follows you across the equator. And in the background, a question began to form. A whisper that would persist for 100 years. Did he really die in that Bolivian rain? Or was that just the greatest heist he ever pulled? The human mind craves closure. It wants the body in the box, the funeral, the period at the end of the sentence. To understand the potential survival of Butch Cassidy, we must first understand the psychology of his exile. When Butch, Sundance, and Etta Place arrived in Argentina in 1901, they didn't hide in a cave. They bought land. They purchased a 15,000-acre ranch in the Colila Valley. It was a lush, green paradise nestled against the Andes. It looked heartbreakingly like the Utah of Butch's youth. For 4 years, they lived the dream. They were the respectable ranchers they had always pretended to be. They raised sheep. They banked under their real names, James Ryan and Harry Place. It was a breathtaking act of hubris, or perhaps a desperate plea for normalcy. But the Pinkerton eye never blinks. In 1905, Frank DeMaio picked up the scent. He was a Pinkerton agent with the tenacity of a bloodhound. He didn't need to ride into Colila with guns blazing. He simply whispered to the local banks and police. These are the men who robbed the Union Pacific. The paradise curdled overnight. The accounts were frozen. The neighbors turned cold. The respectable ranchers were forced back onto the saddle, not by choice, but by the crushing weight of their own past. This is the fork in the road. This is where the narrative splinters. Timeline A tells us they descended into a chaotic spree of robberies across Argentina and Bolivia. It ends in the blood and mud of San Vicente in 1908. But Timeline B opens a door that shouldn't exist. Cut to Spokane, Washington. The year is 1925, the jazz age is roaring. But in a small, grease-stained machine shop, a man named William T. Phillips is quietly grinding gears. Phillips is an unremarkable man. He is a machinist, an inventor, a family man. He has a wife, Gertrude. He pays his taxes. But there are anomalies. He has undergone plastic surgery in Paris. It is a strange extravagance for a machinist. It was ostensibly to fix a hearing problem, though the surgery altered the shape of his ears and tightened the skin around his eyes. And he has a hobby. He writes. In the late 1930s, cancer began to eat away at his stomach. Phillips produced a manuscript. He titled it The Bandit Invincible, the story of Butch Cassidy. It was written in the third person, a biography of the famous outlaw. But as historians and forensic profilers began to dissect the text decades later, the third-person veneer began to crack. The manuscript didn't just recount the crimes, it relived them. Phillips didn't describe the hole-in-the-wall hideout from a map. He described the way the light hit the canyon walls in the afternoon. He described the specific tactical layout of the diamond hitch knots used to secure the stolen gold to the pack horses. This was a skill known only to a handful of veteran wranglers. But the smoking gun was the prison. In the manuscript, Phillips details a plan to break a friend out of the Wyoming State Prison. He describes the interior of the prison with architectural precision. He mentions the dark cells used for solitary confinement, but he doesn't just mention them. He describes the number of bolts on the doors. He describes the specific locking mechanism used in the 1890s. Historical records confirm these details. But here's the catch. Butch Cassidy was never an inmate in the Wyoming State Prison during the time those specific locks were installed. He was a free man. So how would a machinist in Spokane know the bolt count of a solitary confinement cell in Wyoming? Unless he had cased it. Unless he had stood there, breathing the stale air, planning a breakout that never happened. The psychological burden of a double life is isolation. You are the smartest man in the room, but you can never tell anyone why. In the 1930s, the mask of William T. Phillips began to slip. He took a trip to Wyoming. He told his wife he was prospecting, but he wasn't looking for gold in the ground. He was looking for the past. Witnesses claimed to have seen him, old-timers who had ridden the range in the bad old days. They described a man who drove a shiny new touring car, but walked with the rolling gait of a horseman. The most damning encounter involves Mary Boyd. Mary was an old flame, a long-ago lover from Butch's time he spent in Lander, Wyoming. The story goes that Phillips drove to her ranch. He walked up to the porch where the elderly Mary was sitting. They spoke for an hour. No one knows what was said. But when he left, Mary Boyd reportedly walked back into her house. She was pale and shaking. She told her granddaughter, "That was him. That was Butch. He's alive." Why come back? Why risk the hangman's noose after 30 years of safety? Because the ego is a powerful drug. To be dead is to be safe. But to be forgotten is a kind of death that a narcissist like Cassidy couldn't abide. He wanted to see the legend he had left behind. He wanted to attend his own funeral, figuratively speaking. Of course, the thicket is dense with thorns. If Butch survived, what of Sundance? There is a competing theory. It is less substantiated, but persistent. The Sundance Kid also made it out of that Bolivian hut. That he returned to Duchesne, Utah. He lived under the name William Henry Long. Long was a recluse, a dark, brooding man who was terrifyingly accurate with a pistol. He had no family, no past, and a deep, abiding hatred of the law. When the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was released decades later, they said the actor Robert Redford moved exactly like Old Man Long. But the forensics don't hold up as well for Long. DNA tests conducted on Long's remains have been inconclusive or contradictory, unlike the Phillips manuscript, which remains a textual fingerprint. The Sundance theory serves a purpose, however. It highlights the desperate hope of the American West. We want them to have survived. We want the bad guys to win. Because if they beat the system, maybe we can too. But stories and manuscripts are soft evidence. They are memories. And memories rot like fruit. To find the truth, we need hard, cold science. We need bones. And that brings us to 1991, the year the shovel hit the dirt in San Vicente, the year the official story was dragged out into the sunlight and forced to testify. If Percy Seibert lied in 1908, He bought Butch Cassidy a lifetime of freedom. But he also left a puzzle that only forensic anthropology could solve. The grave in Bolivia was marked. The records were clear. The bodies were there. Or were they? San Vicente Cemetery, Bolivia, December 1991. This time, it wasn't the crack of Mausers. It was the roar of generators and the clinking of trowels. The expedition was led by Clyde Snow. If you don't know the name, you should. Snow was the forensic anthropologist who identified the remains of Joseph Mengele in Brazil. He gave names to the disappeared in Argentina's dirty war. He was a man who spoke the language of the dead. He didn't care about legends. He cared about osteology, the story written in calcium and marrow. The premise was simple. Dig up the grave marked for the two Bandidos Yankees. Extract the DNA. Match it to the living descendants of Robert Parker and Harry Longabaugh. Case closed. The media was in a frenzy. Nova and the BBC were there. Cameras were rolling. They were ready to film the final chapter of The Wild Bunch. They expected to find two skeletons, one with a bullet hole in the forehead, one with a bullet hole in the temple. The team began to dig. The earth of the Altiplano is hard, frozen, unforgiving. Layer by layer, they peeled back the decades. When they finally reached the remains, the silence in the pit was deafening. They didn't find two distinct skeletons laid out in a Christian manner. They found a jumble, a chaotic mix of bones. But as Snow and his team began to reassemble the puzzle, the picture didn't match the photograph. First, there was the skull. It had facial features that didn't align with the Caucasian bone structure of Parker or Longabaugh. Second, the DNA. The genetic material was extracted and flown to labs in the United States. They compared it against the mitochondrial DNA of the Parker and Longabaugh families. The computer screens blinked. No match. The bones in the grave did not belong to the Wild Bunch. They belonged to a man named Gustav Zimmer, a German miner who had died in the area around the same time. The implications were seismic. For nearly a century, historians had pointed to that grave. They said, "There lies the end of the outlaw era." But the grave was a lie. This means that on that rainy night in 1908, something else happened. If the bodies in the grave aren't them, where are they? Skeptics will argue that perhaps the bodies were moved, or perhaps the team dug in the wrong spot, misled by shifting grave markers over 80 years. It is a valid scientific critique. The cemetery is chaotic. Records are poor. But consider the alternative. Consider the Percy Seibert variable. Seibert was the only man who identified them. If Seibert walked into that courtyard in 1908, saw two dead drifters who vaguely resembled his friends, and seized the opportunity, he would have gifted them the ultimate alibi. That is Butch Cassidy. With those 4 words, the manhunt stopped. The Pinkertons, satisfied that their prey was rotting in the ground, closed the file. The pressure evaporated, and in that vacuum, Robert LeRoy Parker was free to walk away. He could shave his beard. He could dye his hair. He could board a ship back to the only place that ever felt like home. The failure of the 1991 DNA test didn't prove that William T. Phillips was Butch Cassidy, but it removed the only physical barrier standing in his way. It turned the imposter theory into the survivor probability. July 1937, Spokane, Washington. The end of the outlaw didn't come with a bang. It came with the slow, grinding whimper of rectal cancer. William T. Phillips lay in a bed in Spokane. His body was wasted away. The charm was gone. The strength that had once wrestled steers in Circle Valley was gone. He was just an old man, dying in the middle of the Great Depression. But even in death, he was careful. Phillips left specific instructions. He was not to be buried. He was to be cremated. In 1937, cremation was rare. It was almost scandalous for a man of his standing. But for a man trying to hide his identity, it was a final tactical masterstroke. For a man who knew that one day, science might come looking for his bones. Fire destroys DNA. Fire destroys the evidence of old bullet wounds. Fire erases the past. His ashes were scattered. Some say into the Spokane River. Others say his family took them. But there is a whisper in southern Utah that refuses to die. Go to Circleville, Utah. Talk to the old families. They don't look at the history books. They look at the oral history passed down from grandmothers who were there. The theory goes like this. Butch didn't stay in Spokane. Or at least, he didn't stay dead there. The story claims that the family brought him home, the fiercely loyal, secretive Parker clan. They say he lived his final quiet years not as a machinist, but as a ghost in the high country he loved. And when he finally died, they didn't put him in a public cemetery where a headstone could be photographed by tourists. They took him up to Little Dog Valley. It is a rugged, inaccessible piece of land near the old Parker Ranch. It is the kind of place you only go if you know the way. There, under a canopy of ponderosa pines, in a grave marked only by rocks and the memory of a few sworn protectors, lies the boy from Beaver. Why does it matter? Why do we care if he died in Bolivia or Spokane? Because Butch Cassidy represents the last gasp of American freedom before the fences went up. He was the transition between the horse and the machine. He was a criminal, yes. He stole. He terrified. But he also possessed a code that feels extinct in our modern world. We want him to have survived because we want to believe that you can beat the house. We want to believe that you can sin and run and reinvent yourself and eventually find your way home. The Parker family stayed silent for decades. They bore the shame of his crimes and the burden of his secrets. Lula Parker Bettinson, his sister, famously wrote a book claiming he came back. She looked the world in the eye. He visited us, she said. He ate at our table. Critics called her a liar. They called Phillips a fraud. They pointed to the Bolivian grave and said, "Case closed." But the grave is empty. The manuscript is accurate. And the wind in Little Dog Valley still sounds like a whistle. Robert LeRoy Parker played the longest con in history. He robbed the banks. He robbed the trains. And in the end, he robbed the hangman. He died on his own terms. And for a man who spent his life running, that is the only victory that matters. The story of Butch Cassidy is a house of mirrors. Every time you think you found the exit, you hit another reflection. I want to be clear about where the theories in this episode come from. True crime is built on the hard work of obsession. The foundational theory that Butch Cassidy survived and became William T. Phillips in Spokane comes from the tireless work of Larry Pointer. His books, In Search of Butch Cassidy, and the later Butch Cassidy story, Bandit Invincible, are the Bibles of this case. He was the one who analyzed the Phillips manuscript and connected the dots on the Wyoming prison details, as William Henry Long has been championed by researcher Marilyn Grace. Her documentary work challenges the accepted history of the Duchesne connection, and of course, the science that blew this whole case wide open. The 1991 exhumation in San Vicente. It was led by the legendary forensic anthropologist Clyde Snow. Without his work, we would still be staring at a wooden cross in Bolivia. We would assume the story ended there. History says they died in the rain. The evidence suggests they walked home in the sun. That was The Outlaw Who Died Twice, written and performed by the author, me, James Cawley. We spend so much of our lives digging in the hard, frozen earth, looking for proof that the things we fear and the things we admire have finally been laid to rest. We crave the body in the box and the period at the end of the sentence, because the alternative is far more unsettling. To accept an empty grave is to accept that the past is never truly settled. It is to realize that a man can shave his beard, change his name, and walk right past us in the light of day, carrying 1,000 secrets behind a machinist's smile. Perhaps the greatest heist isn't taking gold from a train, but stealing your own ending from the hands of history, and leaving nothing behind but a whistle on the wind. My name is James Cawley, and you're listening to Dust and Echoes. If you like stories like this, stories that linger in the long shadows of the high desert, where the truth is as thin as the Andean air, and the ghosts of the forgotten West never quite learn how to stay buried, then you're in the right place. I'm glad we found you. If you like listening to these, do me a favor, take 1 minute and leave a review. Reviews are the fuel that gets this podcast discovered and helps me keep this going. I release a new story just for you right here every week. I have a really cool one planned for next week, and I think you'll love it. Until next time, remember this. The thread of a legend is this: it can hold power, even when its roots have been ripped from the ground and exposed. Seek the light. It's inside us all.